Welcome to the Shepherd's Wallet podcast, financial guidance that speaks pastor. I'm Seth Scott, and I help ministry leaders navigate the unique financial complexities that come with answering God's call. Pastors face one of the most complex financial situations of any profession, yet there's a shocking lack of targeted, useful information available to help them. That's what we're here to change. If you've ever felt overwhelmed by housing allowances, confused by SECA taxes, or frustrated that generic financial advice doesn't address your unique ministry situation, you're in exactly the right place. Now, Pastor, imagine if you could invite your board to overhear exactly what I'd say to convince them to invest in your financial well-being. Well, grab your board president and hit play together, because that's exactly what we're doing today. Now, I really appreciate all the pastors that are listening out there. Good on you for taking steps to help ensure that you're taking control of your financial situation. Today's episode is addressed to your church board, and I would love it if you would share this episode with your person of peace on the board, so to speak. You know, the member of the board that you feel like is a true advocate who truly understands your heart for ministry and who can be your advocate to the rest of the board on doing things that the church can do to ensure that you are covered and that you are thriving financially. So in talking with church boards, this is what I would say. I would start with this question: what do you consider to be your church's most valuable asset? Now, it's not the building, because that depreciates over time. It's not the sound system, that becomes obsolete in a year. I would argue that the only thing in the church that really meets the definition of an asset is your pastor, is the pastoral staff. It's the only asset that does two things. One, it appreciates with time. It appreciates with experience. You know, pastors that are in their position longer, are in ministry longer, are more effective at their job. They're more effective kingdom ministers. So they get better with age. And the second thing is they provide current income to the church. Now, I know that churches don't exist to make money. Churches exist to do kingdom work, to bring souls into God's kingdom. And I understand that. But I'm talking to church board members who have a fiduciary duty to the church. And we're going to talk about that term fiduciary in a second. So I'm going to be talking about kind of the business aspects and the fiduciary aspects of your role. And I'm kind of taking for granted that we're all on the same page as far as the purpose of the church being to advance the kingdom. That notwithstanding, however, the church does need revenue. It does need income in order to keep doing what it's doing for the kingdom. And so from a fiduciary standpoint, an asset should be providing current monetary value. And if there's anything that does that in the church, again, it's the pastors. Why do people come to church? Why do people sit in the pews? Why do people give their hard-earned money to the church? It's because of the ministry that they're receiving at that church. It's not because of the fancy building. It's not because of the fancy instruments. It's because of the ministry that's being provided to them by the pastoral staff. So not only would I argue that the pastoral staff is the church's greatest asset, it might actually be the only asset of the church. Now let's go back to this term fiduciary. As a church board member, you have what's called a fiduciary duty to your church. And what a fiduciary is very simply someone who considers the best interest of that over which they have that duty above all else. So you as a church board member, you are charged with the duty of acting in the best interest of the church. Myself, in my capacity as a financial planner, I have a fiduciary duty to my clients. And a lot of times this boils down to two things when it comes to managing their assets. One is, what am I doing to protect the assets of my client? And second, what am I doing to grow the assets of my client? To be a good fiduciary, you have to have both of those things. And as fiduciaries yourself, as church board members, you are charged with protecting and growing the assets of your church, which, as we established, is the pastoral staff. So let's talk about the protection side. I would make the argument that pastors are not being well protected financially on the whole in America. And this is not your fault. This is the fault of a lot of things: legislation, taxation, lack of education, religious stigma. There are a lot of reasons why pastors are vulnerable to financial stress, and the data bear this out. 90% of pastors feel financial stress on a regular basis. 76% of pastors know a colleague who left the ministry specifically because of finances. And over 40% of pastors have considered leaving the ministry themselves this past year due to financial stress. You probably didn't know that. So pastors are feeling financial stress on a regular basis, and it's no wonder. Not only are most pastors severely underpaid, the church budgets are at the mercy of the generous giving of God's people, and the vast plurality of churches in America are not coming out their ears with extra cash. And so a lot of times the church can afford to pay the pastors what they can afford to pay the pastors. And the pastors, because they're called to that ministry, are typically willing to take what the church gives them so that they can do what God called them to do. And so a lot of pastors are in the situation where they are severely underpaid for what they're doing. So not only that, but they're also faced with an unfair and unequitable tax situation. A married pastor making $50,000 a year will pay roughly $1,400 more in total taxes compared to a secular employee at the same income. And that's even taking into account the housing allowance. There are ways to turn that around, fortunately, and I love educating pastors and churches alike in the ways that they can partner together to do that. However, if nothing is done, pastors are facing a very real uphill taxation battle. Pair that with their underpayment and the fact that their financial situation is way different than everybody else's. They have this very unique dual tax status. I would need two hands to give you all of the IRS provisions that apply only to pastors, and that turns financial planning completely on its head. And so they have this complicated situation. They're not getting a lot of targeted support for that. Most of them are underpaid, and they have this unfair taxation system. It's no wonder that 90% of them feel financial stress on a regular basis. So they are very vulnerable and they need protection. And I would argue that that falls to you as the church board to do that as fiduciaries of the church. But not only that, but the church is vulnerable as well. Have you considered what replacement costs would be if you were to lose your pastor? Chemistry Staffing has done the research on this, and the number they came back with is roughly double your pastor's annual salary, is what the church can expect to lose in order to replace that pastor. So if your pastor makes $50,000 a year, you should be prepared to lose about $100,000 net in order to replace that pastor. Now, where does all that go? Some of it is directly incurred costs for advertising and finding people and whatever else. Some of it is due to the fact that, again, you statistically speaking, you're probably underpaying your pastor compared to market rates. And so when you go to hire a new pastor, that new pastor is going to expect to be hired at the current market rates. So that's going to be a raise compared to what you were paying the old pastor. And then finally, let's be real. In times of transition like this, church attendance drops, giving drops, the church loses a lot of revenue, often for months or years after such a transition, depending on how well it's handled. And so between all of that, again, the data says it's roughly 2 times your pastor's annual salary. So that's the risk to the church. And so you're already paying for your pastor's financial stress. Through decreased effectiveness, pastors that are stressed about their finances, first of all, they have to go get other work. The bivocational pastor trend is growing. More and more pastors are not able to make ends meet through ministry alone. They have to find other jobs. That means that they're overly stressed. That means that their attentions are divided, their energies are divided. They're not as effective in ministry. Their tenures are shortened. There's eventual turnover. And again, 2 times pastor's salary is what that tends to cost to the church. So the question isn't whether you're going to pay for your pastor's financial stress. The question is whether you're going to pay that reactively or proactively. And I would argue that proactive payment for this is going to be much more efficient and a much better investment than waiting for things to go south and then just reactionary, going after it There are a lot of churches that don't survive transitions like that, by the way. There's not a whole lot of data on that, unfortunately, at least that I could find. But just anecdotally, I know of a number of churches that lost their lead pastor for whatever reason, for just burnout or for God, for death or moral failure, and the church just simply didn't survive. They couldn't recover from that. And so, this is a good investment. It's right to invest in your pastoral staff. And I have some proactive things that you can do. I got a handful, about 7 things that I want to say that you can do tomorrow. You can start implementing at your next board meeting in order to help cover your pastor financially. I'm going to start with the lower cost and even the zero cost things that you can do. These first couple things don't cost the church anything at all. And the first is to do a payroll audit. Is your pastor being paid correctly? And the way that you would check this, I do pastor tax reviews all the time, and I see churches everywhere that are mishandling their pastor's payroll. They're paying them like normal employees. They're withholding FICA tax, they're withholding Social Security and Medicare tax for them. They're including their housing allowance in their wages so that they're getting overtaxed. They're giving them 1099s for what should be W-2. There's all kinds of things that they should be doing, and there's resources on my website and in my blog to help you know for sure what a pastor's W-2 should look like if it's done correctly. But the 3 main things you look for is box 1, the wages. Make sure the housing allowance or the parsonage allowance is not in there. It should be excluded from box 1. Otherwise, your pastor's getting double taxed. The second thing, you should not be withholding Social Security or Medicare taxes for your pastor. They are self-employed. They do not pay FICA taxes. You pay nothing. That's part of why they have this unfair taxation system, is because they're paying all of it, both the employer and the employee burden. A lot of churches are still withholding FICA taxes for their pastors, and they should not be. And then the third thing is, if your pastor does get a housing allowance, that should be reported in box 14. So just making sure that those things are in place. Again, anybody can check those things. It doesn't cost the church anything to do this big audit. Just make sure those are in place. And that's going to go a long way to at least, to helping your pastor. The second thing is to do a housing allowance review and make this an annual thing. Does your board have an annual rhythm for prompting your pastors to update their housing allowances year on year? I suggest around October, maybe September, sending your pastors a letter, maybe sending them the free housing allowance tool that's on the Shepherd's Wallet website. It's free to download. It's an Excel tool. It's very robust. It includes even a formal request letter from the pastor that they can give to the board that tells exactly what housing allowance they're requesting. And so sending this out sometime in the fall to your pastors so that they can come back and give that to them. And then your last meeting of the year, whether it's November or December, whenever, just look at all those and approve them all at once, set to be effective the next calendar year, and everything is compliant. You're prompting your pastors to update their housing allowance and to stay on top of everything. And you're not doing any of these weird mid-year changes, because you can't retroactively change a housing allowance. It can only be from that moment on. So just making it at the first of the year is just easier for everybody. Now, here are some low-cost, high-impact things that you can do to help your pastors. The first is to set up what's called an accountable reimbursement plan. Stop making your pastor pay out of pocket for doing normal ministry stuff. Your church should have a budget for reimbursing the pastor for things like, going out to coffee with parishioners, if they need extra counseling, helping them build their pastoral library, helping them with their continuing education, things like that. The only way to do that without adding to the tax burden of your pastor is through something called an accountable reimbursement plan. It's not difficult to set up. It just has to be set up correctly. The next thing you can do is make sure you have the right kind of retirement plan for your pastors. You're going to want a 403b9 church retirement plan. If you're not using this, your pastor is probably leaving money on the table and paying taxes they don't have to pay, because a 403b specifically is what's required for a pastor to exclude their contributions from their self-employment income. Not only that, but you're going to want a 403b9 specifically. It's different from a regular 403b, or a 403b7 is what is normally called, because the 403b7 is subject to ERISA, which is the Government Oversight Act that allows the government to, again, have oversight over employer-sponsored retirement plans. Churches are specifically exempt from that requirement. So I don't understand that about 40% of churches have a 401k plan, which is just nuts to me because 401k plans are subject to ERISA. Why would a church willingly give to Caesar what belongs to God in sub- voluntarily submitting themselves when they don't have to that government oversight and additional administration to get a 403b9 retirement plan? It helps your pastors maximize their benefits, and it's just right. It's just the right thing for the church. This next level is the strategic investments. Between 150 and 400 a month, you can get something called key person insurance on your pastor. And the way this works, it's a life insurance policy, usually a permanent life insurance policy rather than a term policy. So if you're thinking like indexed universal life is one of the most common that I see. Whole life maybe. That's kind of an older way of doing things, but it's still around. But essentially what it is the church owns the policy and the church gets paid out on the policy, but the policy is covering the life of the pastor. So here's how it works. We talked about the church being on the hook for roughly double a pastor's salary if they were to leave. Well, the life insurance policy ensures that if the pastor passes away in the middle of their ministry, the church gets paid out to help defray that risk of having to find a new pastor, the dip in giving, all of that. So not only does it cover the church, but it also has this other really beautiful thing where, say, a pastor has been serving a church for decades and they're retiring. The church no longer needs that life insurance policy. So what do they do with it? Well, I think that a beautiful thing that I've seen is that churches will cash out that policy. If it's a permanent life insurance policy, it will have been building up a cash value. And normally that cash value increases proportionate with the number of years that the pastor has been serving the church. And so now the church has a nice golden handshake that they can give to their pastor, sort of a thank you for your service. And they can, as a retirement gift, provide that cash value to the pastor in retirement, which I think is just a beautiful way for the church to honor the sacrifices and the devotion that the pastor has given to the ministry in all of those years. And again, the amount of that payout typically goes up the longer the pastor has been working for the church. And it doesn't cost the church anything additional at that point. It's just a beautiful thing. And the next thing you can do is actually put together a professional development budget. Add a line item to your church's budget, maybe $1,000 a year for each pastor, for conferences and coaching and professional development, materials, continuing education, things like that. It's going to keep your pastors sharp in ministry. It's going to keep them sharp with their theology and their effectiveness in ministry. And it's also going to increase their satisfaction in their job if the church is providing this. So that's something else that churches can do. And the final thing I want to talk about, if you want comprehensive care for your pastors, I'm really excited to announce this new service that we're putting out with Shepherd's Wallet. It's called the Pastor Financial Wellness Partnership. And what this is this is a year-round professional support system that covers your pastors on the church's dime. And so it's meant to prevent these financial problems that pastors find themselves in before they start. Things like a lack of retirement readiness or not optimizing their housing allowance, maybe their taxes being out of compliance, not effectively managing and optimizing all of their unique situations. All of this can be covered through Shepherd's Wallet, through this financial wellness partnership. And there are different tiers that you could look at. It starts at $195 a month. And I think it's just a beautiful picture of the church covering financially those that have sacrificed so much, both monetarily and otherwise, in order to answer God's call and to serve the church. I really think this is something your church should be considering doing. You can check it out on my website, shepherdswallet.com/partnership. So in closing, there are 3 questions I would like you to bring to your board to discuss the next time you meet. The first is, what would happen to our church if our pastor left tomorrow, and what would it cost? You'll probably see deer in the headlights look around because this isn't something that people really think about a lot. But again, the data is clear. chemistry staffing did the report, and it's roughly double the pastor's salary. So that's the answer. It's going to cost double the pastor's annual salary if the pastor were to leave tomorrow. And the second question, are we being faithful stewards of the person God has entrusted to our care? And this is something that I really want to stress, and I really have a strong heart for this. The pastoral staff really has been entrusted to the care of the church board that they serve under. Who else is going to do it? Who else is responsible for caring for the pastors? The pastor's job is to care for everybody else. Who cares for the pastor? And I believe that as fiduciaries of the church, as the managers of the assets of the church, that falls to you as the church board. And the good news is that I just gave you 7 things that you can do to help cover and protect your pastor financially, and to really honor this fact that God has entrusted these souls to your care as the church board. And the third question, which level of action can we implement this month? Again, I just gave you 7 suggestions. Some of them are free. A lot of them are super low cost. Some of them do require investment, but I do consider it an investment because the church and the kingdom is going to get a return on that investment in increased effectiveness, increased pastor tenure, less burnout. The kingdom thrives. The pastors are covered and given double honor. 1 Timothy 5:17, the elders of the church are worthy of double honor. And that's the message that I really want to leave you with as you consider what to do, what more you can do as a church board to make sure your pastors are covered financially. We want to ensure that they're actually walking out the double honor that Paul says that is afforded to them. So, Pastor, if you're still listening, forward this episode to one of your board members and give them this message. I'd love your thoughts on this short presentation about pastoral financial wellness. Could we grab coffee to discuss what this might look like for our church? Because my heart is to ensure that those that cover us spiritually are covered financially. And there's so much cool and fun stuff if the church board is on board and is in partnership, true partnership with the shepherds that serve their church. We can take this inherent disadvantage and turn it into an advantage that continues to pay dividends in the kingdom. And you can be a part as a church board member of ensuring that, at least when it comes to your church, your pastors truly are receiving double honor.
Thank you for joining me on the Shepherd's Wallet podcast. I hope these strategies help you steward your sacred capital with greater confidence and peace. If you found this helpful and would like to go deeper in your stewardship journey, join the Shepherd's Wallet community at shepherdswallet.com/join. You'll get weekly live Q&A sessions, pastor-specific financial tools, and a community of fellow ministry leaders committed to faithful stewardship together. Also, you can pre-order my upcoming book, Shepherding Your Finances. It's the comprehensive guide to everything we talk about on this show, plus implementation worksheets and strategies you won't find anywhere else. Pre-orders are 35% off for a limited time at shepherdingyourfinances.com. Thanks for listening, and remember, you are worthy of double honor, including the honor of proper financial guidance. See you next week.